So, international sanctions. They're one of the biggest tools in geopolitics, right? We hear about them constantly. But what do they actually do? Not just to a country's government or its economy, but to the people living there, day in and day out. Well, a fascinating new study gives us a startlingly clear picture. Okay, let's dive into this.
You know, we usually hear about sanctions in these really big abstract terms like GDP points or trade deficits. But the real story, that's about households, it's about jobs, and it's about what kind of future people can imagine for themselves. The big question has always been, can you actually measure that human impact with any real precision? I mean, can you separate the effect of sanctions from all the other economic noise?
Well, it turns out the answer is yes. This new research does something pretty incredible. It manages to isolate the direct impact of those severe international sanctions that hit Iran back in 2012, and it zooms in on one of the most vital parts of any society, the middle class.
To really understand the impact of what happened, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to see what things were like before. So let's set the scene with the first part of our story, a middle class that was very much on the rise.
For years, the story in Iran was actually a really positive one. After the Iran-Iraq War ended, the country's middle class just kept expanding year after year. It was this steady upward trend. And by 2011, it hit its peak. Almost 2/3 of the entire population had reached a middle-class standard of living. This was a real story of progress.
Now, just so we're all on the same page, when this study talks about the middle class, it's using a very specific definition. It's not just about what you think or feel. It's based on purchasing power. Basically, what your money can actually buy you in your own country. So we're talking about families that have enough to cover the essentials, plus a little extra for things like education, consumer goods, maybe a vacation. They're not on the edge of poverty, but they're not super wealthy either.
But that positive, decades-long trend, it was about to hit a brick wall. And that brings us to the event that changed absolutely everything, the 2012 turning point.
Okay, so this timeline is super helpful for context. You can see the tensions building up over the years. But 2012? That was the big one. That's when the US and the EU put in place these unprecedented sanctions targeting Iran's economic lifeblood, its oil exports, and its entire banking sector. This wasn't just another slap on the wrist. This was a campaign designed for maximum economic pressure.
So you look at the data, and sure enough, right after 2012, the middle class starts to shrink. But as we all know, correlation isn't causation. I mean, the country had other things going on, right? Domestic policies, political issues. So how can we be absolutely sure it was the sanctions that did this?
And this is where things get really clever. The researchers didn't just look at Iran. They decided to build a what-if scenario, a virtual, counterfactual Iran that never got hit with those 2012 sanctions. They used this powerful statistical tool called the synthetic control method. The easiest way to think about it is like creating a virtual twin. The method sifts through data from dozens of countries to find the perfect recipe, a weighted mix of similar countries that weren't under sanctions, to create a synthetic Iran that behaved exactly like the real Iran did right up until 2012.
And listen, this isn't some fringe, experimental thing. We're talking about a method that Nobel Prize-winning economists have called one of the most important innovations for this kind of analysis. It's a seriously robust way to answer these what-if questions using real-world data.
So how do you actually build one of these? Well, it's kind of like a three-step process. First, you look at all of Iran's key economic and social stats before the big event. Second, you let the algorithm find the perfect blend of other countries to replicate those stats. And then third, you combine them to create your synthetic Iran, which now acts as the perfect control group.
So, what's in the secret sauce? What's the recipe for our virtual Iran? Well, it's a pretty interesting mix. The algorithm built it using a blend of 5 countries, with Tunisia, Qatar, and Malaysia making up the biggest shares. Together, they created an almost perfect economic mirror of Iran before the sanctions hit.
And you can see just how well this worked. I mean, look at these numbers before 2012. The middle class size, GDP, even things like school enrollment. Real Iran and synthetic Iran are practically identical. This is what gives us the confidence to say, okay, we have a really reliable what-if scenario here.
Okay, so the stage is set. We have our 2 Irans, the real one, which got sanctioned, and our synthetic twin, which didn't. So now for the big reveal. Let's see what happened after 2012.
This visual says it all. The moment those sanctions hit in 2012, the 2 lines just split apart, dramatically. You can see that synthetic Iran, our what-if Iran, would have likely continued on its path. But the real Iran, its middle class went into a steep nosedive.
The gap between what actually happened and what could have happened, it became a chasm.
And that chasm, well, it has a number, and it is a huge number, 17 percentage points.
So what does that actually mean? It means that, compared to a world without sanctions, Iran's middle class was, on average, 17 percentage points smaller every single year between 2012 and 2019. That is a massive, massive shift. We're talking about millions and millions of people pushed out of the middle class.
And this isn't just some abstract number from a model. It lines up perfectly with how Iranians themselves felt about their own lives. When you look at the World Values Survey, you see a 15-point drop in the number of people who even identified as middle income. The hard data matched people's lived reality.
So, a shrinking middle class is a big deal. It's so much more than a statistic. It creates these massive ripple effects that can change the entire future of a country. Let's take a look at why this matters so much. So how did this actually happen on the ground? The study maps out the entire chain reaction. First, the sanctions slammed the whole economy, right? Slashing national income, messing up trade. That led to a deep freeze on business investment, which in turn caused the industrial sector to shrink. And the final link in that chain, that was the human one. People got pushed out of stable, salaried jobs and had to find more vulnerable, informal work just to get by.
And this is a huge problem because a healthy middle class is basically the engine of a healthy society. These are the people who start small businesses, who push for political reforms, who create stability. When that engine starts to sputter, when people are forced to focus only on day-to-day survival, a country loses its most powerful driver of progress.
So, at the end of the day, the big takeaway here is a pretty sobering one. No matter what the geopolitical goals might be, this research shows that these kinds of broad sanctions can have a devastating and measurable cost on the very social fabric of a nation, hollowing out the one group that is essential for long-term health and stability.
Which leaves us with a really tough question to think about. When the primary effect of an international policy is to push millions of ordinary people out of the middle class, it forces us to ask a really critical question about how we should define and measure the success of that policy in the first place.